Hello, this is Garthastro, Antoine Garth at garthastro.com. And today, instead of how to read your natal chart, we're going to be talking about how not to read your natal chart. And the very first way to read or not to read your natal chart is to say no to the zodiac alphabet, please. What do I mean by that? The zodiac alphabet is basically what we're looking at here. Aries is the first house. Taurus represents the second, Gemini represents the third, equals the third, Cancer equals the fourth, Leo equals the fifth, etc. Now, much of the reason that this was created is because it's a very handy tool or technique for learning astrology, or for kind of visualizing, learning and kind of visualizing astrology, especially if we're looking at it from a psychological developmental state, right? Because we can start with Aries and then how Aries develops to Taurus, etc. And then that also gives us something of a conceptual idea about the houses as well. But as far as the type of astrology that I practice, which is ancient and traditional astrology, there is no correlation, zero. So I just want to make that clear right now. There is zero correlation between, actually, there's only 1% of correlation. We're going to talk about it, but there's zero correlation, aside from one thing, between the zodiac signs and the houses of the chart. Okay, zero, except for one thing, this. The zodiac signs and the houses represent the same body parts. So Aries in the first house represent the head, Taurus in the second house represent the throat, neck, thyroid, and thymus, Gemini in the third house represent the shoulders, arms, and hands, Cancer in the fourth house, the breast, chest, and stomach, Leo in the fifth house, the heart, sides, back, and spine, Virgo in the sixth, the visceral organs, digestive system, Libra in the seventh, kidneys, lower back, and pelvis, Scorpio in the eighth, genitals, bladder, urethra, and anus. This might be why not just Scorpio, but the eighth house is given such a strong sexual thing. Where else are we? Sagittarius, the ninth house, hips and thighs. Capricorn, the 10th house, the knees. Aquarius, legs, and the 11th house, legs and ankles. Pisces in the 12th, the feet. That's the only thing that they share. Okay, so it's not zero. All right, so but that's the only thing that we share. So I'm going to go house to house and talk about why these are not correct. First of all, let's come to Aries in the first house. The first house, it represents vitae, corpus, inganium. Vitae is life, corpus is body, inganium is talent or inclination. Aries is a cardinal / movable sign that initiates action, but it has nothing to do with the physical body. There is nothing in Aries about the body, and the first house specifically, and the ruler and the planetary ruler specifically represent the body. Okay. Okay, Taurus in the second. Now, of course, Taurus likes to substantiate with things. Taurus is a material girl. Taurus likes things that look, smell, feel good, and likes to have lots of the thing it likes around it. And there is, like I said in the last one about the new look at the zodiac in the last video, I said that the second house likes to collect, right? Because the second house also substantiates. That's where it ends. Taurus, that's about it, because the second house represents our finances and our money, our movable wealth. Within the latest time period, it's represented our values, but I don't necessarily go with that. In Vedic astrology, it represents the family even, and our speech. And I do use the second house to represent speech. Taurus has none of those connections. Third, Gemini. So the third house is one of those houses that we wanted to kind of take the deterministic aspect away from it, or take away the stuff that didn't have anything to do with us. And so the third house is one of those houses that doesn't necessarily have to do with us. The third house is the house of siblings, brothers and sisters. It's also the house of short journeys, like journeys by land. So we now think of it as the house of communication and mail and things of that nature. You know, you can maybe see some of that stuff, and of course that's because of why? This connection with Gemini. But even though Gemini is the sign of the twins who are siblings, there's no real connection between the sign of Gemini and siblings. And sure enough, if we were to look at any natal chart, we should be able to give you some information about your sibling if we were to use the third house as an ascendant, which we could in what we call derivative house readings. Fourth house, Cancer, no. Right? So why? Because, and this is actually part of some modern confusion. Why? Because the fourth house is traditionally the house of the father and the house of the origin, the family of origin. And traditionally in these patriarchal cultures, all family of origins are used from the father, right? They're looked at from the father. They're not looked at from the mother, unless you're from a matrilineal culture or from what we would call a matriarchal culture. But certainly the culture that this was in comes from a patriarchal culture, so very different. So fourth house, Cancer, and the patriarchy, remember Cancer is ruled by the moon, doesn't work. Also, Cancer is a water sign, and fourth house is what we call subterranean. It's subterranean, which means under the earth. It represents things on top and under the earth. Cancer is a water sign, nothing. Leo, this is one of the worst. I mean, I thought Leo was the worst, but Cancer is really bad. Leo's the worst, one of the very worst in my opinion, because the fifth house is traditionally the house of children. And for the house of children, you want fertility. There are fertile signs, the fertile signs we just looked at in our last video, Cancer, Pisces, Scorpio, and there are sterile signs, Gemini, Leo, Virgo. Leo is a sterile sign, and the fifth house needs to be a fertile house. Leo don't work. Virgo, now, I guess you get some people that think, okay, Virgo, sixth house, duties. Okay, this is also one of those houses that we cleaned up because we didn't want to imply anything really negative. The sixth house is one of the worst houses of the chart. It represents slavery. It represents enmity. It's called bad fortune. So what we did instead was we connected Virgo to it, and we put things like duty and work and labor and things of that nature. Now, the sixth house is the house of servants, and it is connected to Mercury because Mercury is the natural ruler of servants. But that's as close as anything comes to the sixth house and Virgo. Now, Libra in the seventh seems to make sense because the seventh house is the house of romances and marriages and that kind of thing. However, the seventh house, understand that up until maybe the 19th century, most astrology readings were done by men, were done by men, for men, which means that the seventh house, which would represent the spouse, was called the house of women, right? Libra is a masculine sign. Two, Libra, which kind of works because you think of it as marriage, but it doesn't work for all of the seventh house because the seventh house is not just marriage, but it's contention and divorce, it's lawsuits, it's war and enmity. If we're doing a horary chart where we're asking which army is going to win, we're looking at the first and the seventh house. So seventh, and selling and buying, first and seventh. So there's so much more to the seventh that Libra doesn't come anywhere near. Okay, Scorpio in the eighth house. Now, the eighth house is traditionally the house of fear and terror and death and longevity, fear, terror, and death. Now, Scorpio and the eighth house, I mean, if you want to put all those things in with Scorpio, you can. But remember, Scorpio is a fixed water sign. So it's really about the depths underneath. And I think that might be the closest thing that we can look to with the eighth house, which is called epicataphora, which means to fall down into the underworld. Now, you would think Sagittarius in the ninth house would make sense, especially because the connection between Jupiter and Sagittarius and travel, and the ninth house and long distance travel. However, the ninth house is called the house of God. It is called God, and it is the joy of the sun. And so its significations are mostly the sun's. It's significant because really when it's talking about long distance in the ancient period, it's talking about pilgrimage. It's not talking about travel for fun or tourism. It's talking about pilgrimage, right? And when we pilgrimage to worship God. So ninth house is pilgrimage, and traditionally pilgrimage, we can, of course, using it now for long distance travel is fine. Pilgrimage, which is for the sun. Religion, which is under the sun, because the sun is God and religion. And then divination and prophecy and things of that nature, because the sun is the all-seeing eye in the sky, right? So the sun represents divination and astrology and all of those things in the traditional world. I mean, Mercury represents astrology because of the reading and writing thing, but any form of divination is solar. 10th house. Now, we would think Capricorn makes sense because, Saturn is work, and yours labor, and Capricorn is rising up the mountain, and all of that kind of thing. But really, the actual term for the 10th house was praxis. Praxis, which I think is a really interesting concept. And in Vedic astrology, Mars has what they call Digbala, or situational strength, in the 10th house. So action. So it's basically the actions by which we are known, which Capricorn doesn't really have anything to do. Capricorn is interested in how we are seen, but it isn't really ruling over the actions by which we are known, right? And so the 10th house also is the mother, and Capricorn doesn't have anything to do with that. The 11th house in Aquarius. Now, this is where we get to this idea of the 11th house in groups. The 11th house originally is one of the best houses in the chart. It's called good spirit, and it represents the embodiment of goodness that will help and benefit the person. There were even magical rituals for finding the angel that represented the good spirit in the chart. So it's a completely different thing. Aquarius is the masculine sign of Saturn. Saturn is a malefic. So there's really nothing Saturnian about this. Matter of fact, the 11th house is the joy of Jupiter. So that's where all the benefit is supposed to be happening. The 11th house, not the 9th, where we have where people are putting Sagittarius, but the 11th house, which is the joy of Jupiter. That's where we look for big wigs, or for angel investors, or for whatever, to kind of help us to get to our goal, to get to the pinnacle, of which is the 10th. And then finally, Pisces in the 12th. I mean, that's where, in my opinion, this is another one of these houses where we decided we didn't want to take on these negative meanings. The 12th house is the house of self-undoing. It's the house of secret enemies. It's the house of wailings and lamentations. It is the joy of Saturn. Pisces is the feminine sign of Jupiter. So there's really no connection between Pisces, what we think of as Pisces, and what was going on with the 12th house then, right? What we think of the 12th house now has a very Piscean tinge. What is it? Spirituality, consciousness, that kind of thing. But no, the 12th house is really a house of isolation. It's a house of isolation, being set off apart and away from the light of the sun, and things that are in that house have a tendency to be isolated and to be dealing with isolation, and Pisces has nothing to do with that. So that is our little whirlwind trip through the zodiac alphabet and why you should not be using it. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. And I do a weekly workshop every Sunday PST noon, and it's free. So please join. I'll put the link in the details section, and thanks so much for joining.